at SEI level. And again, we're very pleased to have this session for you today. So just a little bit on the logistics as we go through today's session. It is a broadcast-only webinar, so you won't be able to speak that back to us, but you can type back to us. So if you do have any questions along the way, as soon as they pop into your mind, please just type them into the Q&A panel, the question and answer panel in GoToWebinar, and we will queue those up. We will leave some time at the end of the session today to run through those. And, so yeah, as we go through, please type them in. I think that's about the only logistics thing we have. You can listen to it audio-wise through your speakers on your computer. Of course, plug it into a headset and so on. If you do have trouble with that, there is a telephone option as well. You should see that in your control panel. So Joy will be doing probably the bulk of the presenting today. In terms of concepts, what I'm going to do is show you how the concepts Joy presents can be supported with the modern requirements definition and management platform, namely Blueprint. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joy for the first part. Joy?
Great, thanks, Tony. All right, let me cue our first slide. So this is an agenda of what we're going to talk about today. I am going to present to you 3 different models. And the goal is that you would actually be able to walk out of this webinar and use these models on your project immediately, no matter where you're at. If you're at the beginning of a project or right in the middle of a project, there's probably something here you could start doing to improve the requirements on your project today. And super excited that Tony's going to be able to show you how these are then created within Blueprint. And even our screenshots throughout this you're going to see are actually screenshots right out of Blueprint. So the models look awesome. I'm really excited about that and be able to collaborate with him on this and share that with all of you. So before I dive into the models, I want to introduce you to Blue. Blue's a BA. Whenever I give any kind of a talk or do training, I really like to tell stories from our real projects. I feel like that helps make the concepts something that you can take home and apply to your own work. That said, I have to protect the innocent in our stories sometimes, so I relate them all back to our generic Blue, the BA. In this particular case, Blue recently was moved on to a project that was already underway. There were about 40 use cases written, but each of those use cases was 20 pages long. Absolutely not something you could consume. A 20-page use case is just far, far too complex. In addition, the team had written on the order of, a few hundred system shell statements. Blue's job was to come in and figure out where are we missing any requirements. A pretty daunting task, I would say. Now, Blue's a busy BA. He has a lot on his plate. There's all kinds of information out there that exists, and he's pretty sure that the requirements that they've written are actually good, but there's no way to process through that much information to figure out where are their gaps, where are there overlaps, duplicates, and things like that. So what we're going to talk about today are some different tools that Blue can use to actually help figure that problem out. Is he missing requirements? Does he have a full set or not? So let's back up a minute and talk about requirements models. Why is it that we even need to model information in the first place? Well, back in the 1950s, there's a psychologist, George Miller, who did some studies to demonstrate that the human brain has the capacity to process about 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time. Right? So between 5 and 9 things, that is all the human brain can actually process at a time, at once. And what I mean by that, if you have 15 things and you try and put 15 things in your mind and start to do something with that information, you won't be able to get through all 15. We just literally are not capable of doing it. As an aside, there are some other studies that show this number might even be smaller. It certainly isn't bigger. So to demonstrate that, think about going to the grocery store. If you needed to get 15 things from the grocery store and you didn't write them down on a list, it is very unlikely that you would go into the store and come back out with those exact 15 things. You could probably come out with 15 things. They just might not be the 15 things that you need. So your list would probably be incomplete at the end of your shopping trip. My husband likes to joke that if I sent him to the store to get 15 things, he would actually have to make 15 trips to get it right. However, what's interesting is we can take those 15 pieces of information and start to organize them, perhaps into the grocery store departments, right? If I were to say I had 5 dairy things and 5 produce things and so on, what happens is that when I get into the grocery store and I go to the produce section, I bring into my mind, okay, what are those 5 things I needed from the produce section? I buy them, or I put them in my cart, and then I immediately put them back out of my mind, and I clear my mind of them and bring into mind what are the 5 dairy things I need. And now I can process those 5 particular things. So what I'm doing is organizing the information in some sort of model such that my brain can actually process it. So it is conceivable that I could go to the grocery store and get the 15 things if I appropriately organize them in my mind. Now what you see in front of you here are a bunch of different requirements models. We've pulled these all together into what we would call a requirements modeling language, or for short that would be RML. It's a bit of a mouthful. There's 22 different models here. Some of these are probably going to look familiar to you, at least by name, if you're not already using them. What we've done is pulled together the set of models that we think is most useful to help us get our requirements right. Now, in creating our requirements models, we really like to think about a couple different key factors. Number one, are the models easy to use, easy to create, right? So as a BA, do I have to go take a week of training to figure out how to make a particular model? If so, that is not easy. Are they easy to consume as a business user or as a developer, somebody either has to review it or use the requirements model to go create a product, right? Do they need to be trained, or can they just consume them? Right? So the idea is how can we make each model as simple as possible to do what it still needs to do to help us get our requirements right. So that's what we tried to do. So you may recognize some of these by name, but they may look a little bit different in what I show you, and that's why, is we're trying to really simplify the language to make it very, very consumable. Now, I just told you that the human brain can only process between 5 and 9 things, yet I just showed you 22 models. So if I'm in the middle of my project and all I have are 22 models, that is going to be really hard for me to stop and figure out which model should I use. I'm not going to be able to think of what all the models are. So what we have done is organize them into categories. We refer to this as OPSD, objectives, models, people, systems, models, data models. So OPSD is the acronym to help you remember the different categories of models. So objectives models are all about why are we doing a project, right? What is the business value of this thing that we're building? People models help us figure out who is going to use the system and how they will use the system. System models are all about the interactions that happen between different systems or inside the systems. And then we have our data models. So this is looking at the life cycle of the data that is processed in the system, right? So we can think about how is data created, how is the data used, how is it transformed inside the system, how is it output from the system. So these are the 4 categories of models, and this shows you all 22 models put into the different categories. The ones in bold are the ones I'm going to talk about today. Again, in an hour, we only have time to go through a few of them, so I've picked 3 that I really think you could start using immediately. So the process flow, most of you will have been at least familiar with that or seen them if you don't use them, so I'll talk about how that relates to requirements. I'm also going to show you the display action response model, which is all about modeling user interface requirements, right? So not just a screenshot, but we have a little bit more information we want to capture about those user interfaces. And then our requirements mapping matrix, which is going to tie everything together. This is an approach that I really do think you could use immediately. If you were to start creating process flows, put them in what we call the requirements mapping matrix, then we create those DAR models, that's the UI requirement model, and then we put those in the requirements matching matrix. This helps us make sure we have some completeness in our requirements, particularly that requirements mapping matrix is going to tie that back together. So this is the flow that we're going to walk through. Before I do that, Tony's going to actually give you a quick introduction to Blueprint just to give you a feel for what the tool looks like.
Okay, thank you, Joy. Now bear with me while I grab the steering wheel, as it were. And can you just confirm, Joy, that you're seeing pretty much an empty screen right now? Slide.
I can confirm that, yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so thanks very much. And so before we continue getting into those models that Joy referred to, I just wanted to give you a quick intro to Blueprint just to set the stage, and then afterwards I'll give you a more detailed demonstration of how we actually do the models that Joy's going to talk about. So what Blueprint is, for those of you who don't know us, it's a modern, centralized, web-based requirements definition and management platform. And what Blueprint does is a few things. It lets you author requirements using a wide range of visual editors. You can validate requirements with online reviews that leverage simulation, which I'll show you a little later. And you can also generate documents automatically, your requirements documents. Lets you manage requirements with traceability, versions, baselines, visual differencing, the ability to reuse requirements across projects even. And it lets BAs, managers, and IT leaders monitor requirements, activities, status, progress across a project or portfolio of projects. It also lets teams, whether they're co-located or remote, collaborate on requirements using a range of built-in social features. Since Blueprint is totally focused on requirements and getting them right, we need strong integrations with tool sets in the rest of the life cycle. And to that end, Blueprint provides integrations with Microsoft Office, so that's Visio, Excel, Word, both in and out, and also integrations with HP ALM Quality Center, Microsoft Team Foundation Server, and we just announced last week that in a few weeks we're going to be delivering integrations with a wide range of additional products, including Rally version 1, Jira, Rational Team Concert, and many, many more, so stay tuned for that. And as part of the integration, Blueprint also generates tests automatically as well. Finally, since Blueprint is an enterprise-class solution, a big part of what that means is an ability to administer across large distributed teams of users. So we provide a central system of record for the requirements with access that's managed through role-based security for users and groups. It's also highly configurable, letting you tailor it to suit the needs of individual projects and support just about any process you might imagine. So with that as a sort of a broad overview of Blueprint, let me just give you a quick glimpse of the product itself and a quick intro to it, which will set the stage again for a later demonstration. So this is a main screen of Blueprint. We did model the user interface design off of Microsoft Office because, quite honestly, most of the business analysts who are coming to Blueprint are coming from using Microsoft Office as their principal tool for doing requirements. So it was only natural. So ribbon at the top. This particular view was patterned off of Outlook, which is really designed to handle large volumes of information, kind of like what we have with requirements. So main navigation on the left, where we could have multiple projects open at once. What you happen to be working on is in the center. And then whatever you happen to have selected, the details for that are shown off to the right-hand side in the utility panel with multiple tabs. In the center main working area, you can just double-click the tab to maximize the real estate and kind of dismiss that left and right wing, if you will. They're always there, so you can go back to them if you want. And this is the main artifact list view for Blueprint. So your requirements information is really organized through the folder structure that you see here. You can set it up however you want. This is just how I set up my folder structure for requirements. It takes care of putting unique IDs on every single requirements artifact. And to the right, there's properties as indicated by the columns. So you can define your own properties. You can hide or expose them, reorder them through drag and drop, and save those settings as views as well, as long with sorting and filtering, private and public views. In addition to that, even though Blueprint is a web-based application, I'm running in, what am I running in? Google Chrome right now as a browser. You can use Firefox or Internet Explorer if you want. Even though it's a web-based application, it's a very rich client interface. I mean, to the point where you pretty much feel you're working in a native application, not a web application, with everything drop-down selectable, double-click to edit anything in place, and just hit save to send it off. And so that is really just what I wanted to do to give you a quick orientation. Again, after Joy discusses more models and concepts, I'll show you specifically how Blueprint can support those. So I am going to take a minute and pass it back to Joy. You should have the control now, I think, Joy.
I think so. Let's see.
And
Okay.
I see your screen.
Great. Okay, cool. Yep. All right. Good intro to Blueprint. I think you guys are going to love it when you see these models inside of it. So let's start and talk about process flows first. Again, I think most people that I talk to have at least seen process flows or know what they are. Not all of them actually use process flows in their requirements, so I'm hoping to maybe open your mind to that idea here. So very, very quickly, let's talk about symbols for a minute. Those rectangles are steps. The diamonds are decisions. You can reference other processes as well. The little blue character is certainly not standard in a process flow. He's just there for fun. One of the key things here I want to show you is these things called swim lanes. Over on the left, you see user/user group, right? So those are different groups that are performing the steps that are within their particular swim lane. So when you have a complicated swim lane, process flow, you're going to want to use swim lanes to help divide that up a little bit. The reason that we love process flows is that they really align to how people think about doing their jobs. So when you're trying to work with your customers, your business users, to understand what their requirements are, process flows are very, very natural for them because it's how they think about what they do every day. One of the things that I really encourage people to do, and this is a little bit different, is to not try and mix the people steps and the system steps in the same diagram. We would treat those as separate models. So I might create a process flow that shows my people steps, and then separately I might create a system flow which shows the things that the system is doing to complete a process. And the reason for that is that if I start to mix paradigms of people and systems, it's much harder to actually look at the diagram and figure out, is it actually complete, which again is one of our main purposes with models. So again, we love process flows because they're easy for our stakeholders to work with, and in fact sometimes they can help create them for you, maybe get you started, and then you will go ahead and perfect it. They also are nice, to hand off to your developers, to your test groups, things like that, because it'll give them some context for all those written requirements. You still have to write requirements. I'm not taking that particular activity away here, but what I'm trying to do is add some context to those requirements so that people can consume them and understand what's going on, right? So if I need to model some kind of complex branching and I try to list that out in a bunch of system shell statements, really hard to see what's going on. I put it in a model like this and it becomes very, very obvious. The other thing I'll say that is great about process flows, once you have them, is you can start to organize your requirements by them, and we're going to see a model to do that in a minute, but the idea is I can actually write them at a level where each step's going to help me figure out, okay, what are the requirements I need to complete that particular step, and then I do the next step. And I organize my requirements in that fashion, so I end up creating more complete requirements while I'm actually doing the elicitation, but then I have some easy checks to go back and do later on to make sure that I'm not missing anything if I've organized my requirements this way. The other thing I'll say is you don't see a lot of symbols on the screen right now, and if you're familiar with BPMN, Business Process Modeling Notation, you certainly are probably aware that there are a lot more symbols that you can use in BPMN. Now what we've done is really tried to make this, again, what are the basic symbols that I have to convey a process flow for requirements purposes, right? Our intent here is not to do full business process modeling, it's to get us to good requirements. So that's important. Now if you know some symbols in BPMN and you need them, it's okay to add them. There's certainly no harm in that, but again, you want to make sure you're creating a requirements model that the average business user, the average developer can consume it without having a lot of training. So the symbols have got to be relatively obvious to them is what I'll say. Let's look at an actual example now. So to keep it simple, I'm going to talk about an online store example today. I feel like that's something that most people would be able to relate to if you've ever purchased anything online. So we're going to look at the add to cart process flow. And first of all, I'm going to give you the L1 here is what I call it. That's the top level, level 1 process flow, which shows the full cart and checkout. There's not a lot of branching at that level. It's really about orienting what is the full life cycle here. So I put an item in my cart, I choose an address, a billing address, I choose payment, and so on, right, all the way through checkout. So that's our top level, but then we go into our L2, which is that level 2, one level below it, and I'm taking that add item cart step and breaking it out into a lot more detail, okay? So here you can see if I'm adding an item to cart, I'm going to select my criteria to browse. I'm going to choose some filters to narrow the results down. I might select my item. If they have my size, great, I add it to the cart. If not, I come back and maybe change the filters and try to find a different product. All right, so pretty simple process flow here. But what I want you to notice is a couple things. There's some value add right up front by thinking about breaking up my system into these processes. That top level L1 process flow, those are major chunks of work I could actually give to different BAs, so I could organize my work this way. I could organize sections of my requirements documentation this way if I do exports of requirements documents. So there's lots of value just even in doing this. But what's nice is when I get into that second level, it's written in a way such that each step has a handful of requirements, system requirements, that is going to fall right out of it. So I can think about what are the requirements to select criteria for browsing. Okay? Then I would think about what are the requirements for filtering. Then I would think about what are the requirements for selecting an item. Right? So again, I'm getting very granular in my process flow so that when I try and derive requirements out of this, it's actually pretty straightforward. Now, this is our second model, the requirements mapping matrix. So a requirements mapping matrix, a lot of organizations might call that a traceability matrix. I will give you a little bit of a hint. It's very similar. Certainly serves some of the same purposes. We actually rename it somewhat just because traceability can have a bad connotation in a lot of organizations. People think, oh, it's a lot of overhead. I just have to create this thing so that I can say that I did it. I won't actually use it. So we're trying to take away that connotation by referring to it in a different way. But we actually do create them in a slightly different way than most organizations. And I'm going to show you that in a couple slides where we actually are able to trace multiple things at once, which the average matrix wouldn't necessarily allow you to do that. So this is our requirements mapping matrix. It's basically a matrix. You can have whatever you want in the columns. You could map any requirements objects. You could even map design or development objects or test objects into this exact same format. In this particular case, what we've done is put the add item to cart in the matrix. You'll see down the left, that's the add item to cart process flow. The second column is taking each step in that process flow and putting it as an individual row in the matrix. And then the third column is putting the individual requirements in, and they're mapping back to the steps that they are derived from. Now, this particular view, what you can see is if we have 3 requirements for a given step, we just repeat that row in the matrix. So choose filter to narrow results. There's 3 of them because there's 3 requirements that map back to it. Right? Different views of this information will help you show that in different ways, certainly, but this is a very simple way to do it. Again, this is a screenshot that Tony took right out of Blueprint for us for the presentation. So we didn't concoct this. This is real stuff right in the tool, which is lovely. So again, the idea of this is we can map our requirements back to our process flow steps. And I will tell you that there are 3 purposes I think that serves. Number 1, when I go to review my requirements, no longer do I have the list of 100 or 200 or even 1,000 requirements without organization. What I can do here is I can start to filter. I can say, okay, business users, we're going to look at the requirements for adding an item to cart and nothing else. Right? So I use this view and I select all, I just over in column 1 select down what is add item to cart, and I pick all the requirements then immediately that fit with that process flow. So it makes my review process easier. The second value that comes out of this is I can find missing requirements very quickly. If I look at this matrix and I had no requirements next to have size, step 4, that tells me I might have a gap in my requirements, right? So remember blue up front, that's the thing we were trying to do, is find those missing requirements. By mapping our requirements back to processes like this, there's actually a reasonable chance they're just going to pop right out at me in this kind of a structure. The other thing that's nice, the third thing I think is a huge value out of this, is you can find requirements that you don't need, that scope creep. Right? So if somebody's told you requirements, you go back and you try and map them back to a process step, and there isn't one that they map to, then that's a good indication that you probably actually don't need the requirements. It also might be an indication you're missing a process step, so be open to that. But again, it's that two-way. I'm looking both directions to see where do I have extra stuff, or where do I think that maybe I'm missing them. So again, love the requirements mapping matrix, and what I will tell you is you can do them manually, but it's really, really time consuming. So that's where you're going to want to use a requirements tool like Blueprint to help you with this. valuable tool, just really, really difficult to try and manage it on your own. All right, let's talk about our third model. This is the Display Action Response model. So I'm going to call that DAR for short, because again, Display Action Response is a bit of a mouthful. But what happens typically with user interface requirements is that what we'll see is people provide a screenshot, and then they might provide a long list of requirements, much like you see over here on the right. But the problem is there's no tie, there's no connection between those requirements and the screen on the left, so there's no way to know, do I really have all the user interface requirements, right? So very, very challenging. This is our DAR model, or again, our Display Action Response model, where what I've done is I've still got my screenshot. That has to exist. I have to be able to show visually what that screen's going to look like. It can be low fidelity, but I'm showing what are the things on the screen. And then I create these element tables. And an element is any particular field or button or an area of the screen. So for example, up here, the name would be an element. Okay? I create a table like this for every single element that has requirements associated with it. Now, in the element table, I've got some basic information around. I'm going to give it a unique identifier. I'm going to give it a description. Very simple, plain English. This is what that field is. And then I'm going to talk about the display requirements. So in different conditions, how does that element display? The classic example is a login, log out button. Okay? If I am logged in, the button says log out. If I am logged out, the button would say log in. Okay? So in different conditions, that button will look different. And then the third section of this table is where we get into the behavior of the elements. So given a particular state, the user does something, how does the system respond? And it's all in relation to that individual element. So we're going to actually look at an example because I think that will probably put this into a bit more context for you all. This example is for these filter fields here up on the left. So going back to our e-store, remember I was talking about how you would, if you were browsing for a product, you might want to narrow down your results by filtering. Okay, so that's what these filters here on the left are. So let me walk you through the table, and then I'll come back and put a little bit more context about this again. So first of all, we've got a unique ID for it and a name. In this particular case, it's called filters. Then we have a description, which is, again, simple English that tells the reader the filters are all about allowing a user to further reduce the products that they see while browsing. The display section, if I'm at the home page of my application, then no filters are displayed. But if I browse into a catalog, then the applicable filters display for a selected category. So for example, if I browsed into jackets, then my filters might be things like size, color, and fabric. Okay? Now, the third section is probably the most interesting in this particular example, and that's how does that element, those filters, how do they behave? Okay? So if no filters are selected and the user selects the first filter, then I'm going to update and only show the available product results that have the value of that filter criteria. Seems obvious, right? One or more selected filters, then I select another filter, then I only show available product results that meet all the filter criteria selected. This one I think is probably the most interesting line, and it gets to the heart of why we need this particular model. If I look at that more closely, what I'm saying is that the moment that I have more than one filter selected, I want to show product results that meet all of the criteria. And that's important because if you don't tell someone, they may develop that as an or instead of an and, right? So I could say it could be filter 1 or filter 2 or filter 3. But what I want is for them all to apply. And that might be obvious to you, but that is not necessarily obvious to your developer. Okay, so that's why we're getting to this level of detail, is we're telling them right here that we need to make sure that those criteria are anded together and the results meet all of those different filters. Okay, and then the last one is one or more filters selected. I would show all, or I would select show all, and then the product's result to remove the filter from that particular search result. So again, I really want to emphasize that the DAR model helps remove any ambiguity in how our user interface requirements are specified. I'm going to tell you that this model was actually created in conjunction with a major website. It was a retail site. Just millions of users were going to hit this thing. They could not afford to get it wrong. This was 10 years ago, and the project was one of this organization's first offshore development projects. And so there's a lot of concern because the developers, they didn't know what they would know or not know, and there was a language barrier. So when you added all these risks together, what they were concerned about is that they would get some not so obvious behaviors developed if we didn't go to this level of detail. Now, the average project might not need to create element tables for every single element because some of them might be obvious, right? So if you're confident that your developers could develop the login and the logout functionality that I described and they could get that correct, then you don't need to specify it. I'm not saying do this for everything, but if you have some particularly risky parts of your user interface, or maybe something really complex like these filters, maybe you just specify these requirements, these types of requirements for just those few pieces of the system. Okay, so really pay attention to that. The other thing to think about is how familiar are your developers with the system already, or how familiar are you with them? Are they offshore? Is there a language barrier? All those kinds of things might lead us down the path of being a bit more precise in our requirement specification. That's when you're going to want to use a model like this one. And the big thing is just be careful that you're not making any assumptions about what you think is obvious in a user interface might very well not be obvious to someone else building it. Okay, and finally, I want to tie this back to that requirements mapping matrix for you. So that was the model we saw a moment ago where we had the process steps mapped to requirements. What's really cool is you can start to add other objects to that same model. So in this particular case, we've added another column. It's the third column over, called DAR. And what we've done is we're starting to map our actual steps in the process to our screens in the user interface, or our fields in the user interface. Right? So what this tells me is that as I'm going through my process, these are the different elements on the screen that I would use. And how it helps me is to figure out, am I missing something on my user interface? Right? If I went through this process and I got down to the add to cart step and there was no user interface element to map to, then that tells me I'm probably missing my add to cart button on my screen. Okay? Similarly, if I have elements on my screen that I've specified how they should work, but it doesn't map back to something in my process, then I have to question, why am I building it? Why do I need it in my user interface? Perhaps I have some kind of scope that I could cut there. All right, so again, same kind of mapping that happened with our requirements back and forth to help us find the extra information or help us find the gaps. And again, you can do this with any model, with anything else. You could put business objectives in this particular requirements mapping matrix, so you can map all of your requirements back to business objectives. You could add, over on the far right, you might add test cases so that you're validating that you have a test case for every single requirement as well. So you can do whatever you want with that, and that's one of the big distinctions over your typical traceability matrices, is it lets us see a lot of different information at once. Okay? I think with that, Tony, I'm going to hand it back to you to show a bit more in Blueprint directly.
Okay. 1 second, please. Just grabbing the...
All right, you're good to go.
Okay, you can see it well. Okay, good. Excuse me. Okay, well, thanks again. And so I'm just going to continue on with the demo blueprint after this, then we'll get into the Q&A. So I gave you a bit of an overview of the product. One thing I didn't dive into detail on was that right-hand side, so let me do that now. This main view, again, is how we organize our requirements information, as I had said. If I come down here, you can see the different kinds of artifacts. I'm going to cycle through some of them, but if I were to pick one like this screen or screen mockup, and let me pick a different one like login, for example, because I'm going to get back to the other one in a second. So obviously this is a wireframe, a low fidelity kind of mockup, which you can do very quickly with palette on the right-hand side through drag and drop. But in the far right-hand side, again, we have detailed tabs that provide information about what it is you're working on, in this case, a screen mockup. So we have the details of it here, who created it, when, you know, width and height and so on. We can have discussions associated with whatever I'm working on, in this case a screen. Important to note that I can also pick individual things, like maybe even this submit button on the screen, and I can have discussions on that if I choose. So it can get very fine-grained. We can also have attachments on any of these things. I have a couple of files here. We can have traceability to or from or bidirectional to, again, whatever I'm working on, in this case the screen, or to individual elements on the screen. If it's a complex artifact, so I would call this a complex artifact. It actually is a screen that contains other elements, and there can be other groupings. Then the details of that are shown in this tab. Finally, a little search utility. So if I type something like login, it'll go through the entire project and show me what elements have that name. And one of the last things I want to show you is that each of these is also completely version controlled in the background. And you don't have to worry yourself about this. It's just every time you make a change, in behind the scenes, Blueprint will take care of making another version for you and keeping things under control. So in this case, the screen has gone through 5 versions in its life. And you can click any of these numbers to pull an old version out of the database and see what it used to look like. By clicking on any of the versions, like this most recent version, 5, beneath, it'll show you what specifically has changed to cause that version to be created. And if you'd rather see it instead of trying to study the text and figure it out, you can just open a side-by-side view, and it will actually show you visually what the differences are. In this case, we added some additional options to the far left for logging in with your Facebook credentials and so on. So that gives you a quick run through of that utility tab. The last one is actually showing you what reviews this screen happens to be involved with. It could be in multiple reviews right now. This one happens to be in one. So back from the organization, a real quick fly through just on some of the artifact types that Blueprint supports. So business process models or business process diagrams. Again, they adhere to the BPMN standard, but it isn't, overpowering, I would say. There is a very small palette on the right-hand side, so those that don't need BPMN can just use this, drag, drop, create what you see in front of you. But if you do need the power, all you need to do is right-click, and you can get all the different annotations simply through right-clicking, like this. Okay? So all the BPMN symbology is there and available to you if you want. If you don't want, then it doesn't get in your way. There's information models or domain diagrams or conceptual data models, whatever you want to call it, to represent the major information elements, what they consist of, and the relationships between them. Generic diagrams, as the name implies, it's a blank canvas. You can use shapes and images to build what you need or what you want, like a conceptual diagram of our system and multiple systems in our environment, org charts, really what have you. But the important thing here is that, again, every element on this screen, Blueprint considers to be its own independent artifact, meaning we can have discussions on it, meaning we can attach things to it, meaning we could trace to and from. So even these diagrams become, a full part of that requirements family, if you will. As I showed you before, screen mock-ups, either wireframe or high fidelity if you want. You can do all of that. You can take mixtures of the high fidelity and wireframe and put them into a storyboard and sequence them through. You can have multiple storyboards if you want to show the various scenarios that one would go through. Use case diagrams are supported as well. And if I were to double-click on a use case, I go inside that use case, and we can see its internals, and we can specify those. We can do that in either graphical, using a graphical editor on the right or a structured text editor on the left-hand side. So it's the main flow and alternate flows. Again, these two are identical. I can type a character in one, it instantly appears on the other, so you truly can just pick the one you prefer to work in. And if you have multiple people working together on use cases, of course, some could be working in the visual side and some on the structured text side. I'll just get rid of a few of these tabs, which I'm not going to go back to, to shorten things up a little bit. I will not save my changes that I made there. Okay, so that is a quick fly-through of many of the artifact types that Blueprint supports. Now, one over here that I'm going to show you is basically back to a business process that we had that Joy was showing you in the diagram. This is where, in fact, we made it. Oops, excuse me, my mouse issues. And in the presentation Joy had made, there was one of the steps or tasks in the business process here actually had a subtask, and in Blueprint, we represent that like this. You click on it and you go into that subtask. And on the right-hand side, you can show the details of this information. So every one of these, as I mentioned, every one of these steps or tasks is its own artifact. And the little indicator at the top really shows you that it has relationships. If I were to click one of those, I can see that this step, as Joy had mentioned, has requirements from it. It also is related to screen elements. And this is true of every one of these steps. This is all interrelated, so if I were to click one of these requirements that is associated with step number 2, it goes to that textual requirement and we can see it. This one is system does not display filters for categories that the user's already selected during browsing, for example. And with every text requirement, as any artifact, and indeed we have multiple properties that you can specify for those as well. So each one of these, as you're working in Blueprint, you can navigate around from your business process to the requirements that are associated with it, and even to those screen elements in the mockups. So if I click this one, which is associated with the filters on that product information screen, it takes me to that screen, the one you saw in Joy's presentation, and it highlights that filter product catalog element. So I know which one it's related to. Now, you probably saw a glimpse of it a moment ago, but in its entirety, if I want to see the complete mapping, I want to see the RMM for that. Well, in Blueprint, we would capture that down below in the description field for this process. So again, this is the table, the DAR table that you saw in Joy's presentation with the L1 process, the more detailed L2s, the associated requirements, and then the screen elements. All of this is, again, clickable. It's all interrelated. So, you know, the Add to Cart button, if I were to click that, it will take me to that screen again and highlight the Add to Cart button. Now, another thing that we're able to do with Blueprint, actually just before I head off there, just to finish that thought, Joy also had shown you element tables. So each element on this screen can have an element table describing its behavior. So if I were to pick filter product catalog, there is the element table for that particular screen element, showing preconditions, the actions and responses for all of its behavior, and the other information. So everything Joy had showed you in those models is actually captured and supported in the product. Now, in addition to that, another thing that Blueprint allows you to do is simulate this information and bring it to life. So I already have a simulation running of this particular content. I'm just going to flip over to that because that is in a different experience. You click Simulate in Blueprint, it will launch this experience. And what it'll do is position you at the beginning of the process. It'll pull together all the process information and automatically pull it together and render it in this activity diagram or flow chart, however you like to refer to it. And you can see that end to end. And as we go through the simulation, those screen mock-ups you have will appear on the left-hand side. So you can, again, follow kind of the path as we transition through here and experience the screens. And we have a little English language narrative down below. So at the moment, the browser happens to be open, which of course we can see, and we're at the beginning. If you click Next, we go to the next step where it says the customer is going to navigate to this web address, bpr.com. So I will actually do that. Whenever it says customer or user does something, you can actually do it in the screen. So I will go to my keyboard, www.bpair.com, and I'll say let's go. And just by clicking that, it'll push me down. You can see we're going through the flow chart here as well. And in response to us doing that, the system gives us the login screen, which is great. I can see it. Next step, customer's going to log in. This happens to be an include, so we slide right through that to the point where we do the work. It could be a valid or an invalid login. Let's say it's valid. So I can do it up here, put in my password, hit the submit button, pushes us down, and says in response to a successful login, we present the main page. So you get the point of the flowchart over here to the right. I'm just going to dismiss that so I can maximize my real estate here. And I'll just use the whole area for my screen mock-up. Let me shrink that down a little bit so we can see better. So we're on the main page. The next step is we actually have a choice here, one of many, where we could either, at this point, we can book a flight, register for rewards, many things, including shop for merchandise. So I'm going to pick that one. I can also interact with the screen. So I'll just click the shop button, pushes me down to the point where we get the screen that you saw I had mocked up in Blueprint, and I showed you back in the Blueprint editing space. So this is that same screen just brought into the simulation. Next step is the customer selects filter 1, and I can see that filter 2 and 3 are disabled or grayed out. Filter 1, I'm going to pick clothing. In response to me doing that, the system's going to enable 2, which it did. What do we do next? Well, pick filter 2. Okay, I'm going to pick t-shirts. In response, it enables 3. Next step, pick filter 3. I'll pick men's t-shirts. In response to that, we get the various men's t-shirt options down here below. Next step, customer picks one, so I will pick the standard one. When I pick that, I get a picture, I get my size information, I get reviews, I get the details about that particular product, and that's, the text tells me that's what's going to happen in the process step. Finally, the next step says that the customer adds this product to their cart. Okay, so there's the add to cart button, and now my cart gets incremented to 1. Now, at this point in the simulator off to the right, I can even come down and I see somebody else has been in here saying, you know, I think it looks good, you know, but the shopping cart needs to be bigger. There's always one in the crowd. So we can respond to that and basically continue the discussion and offer our feedback as well. So, I mean, the whole point of this and visual models in general, of course, is to make things far more understandable, far more consumable for those that need to receive that information in a review capacity, or they're going to be developing or testing from it. And simulation just takes it one step further, actually letting you experience it in the end. So I hope you got that point. And with that, I'm just going to dismiss the simulator and go back to the main Blueprint product just for a moment. So pretty well covered just about everything we wanted to today. The last thing I may show you is the fact that Blueprint also does do a traditional traceability matrix as well automatically. So this one I had already pulled up, and you can set all sorts of filters here. So I filtered it down just to look at that business process and the screen and the textual requirements we were dealing with. Another tool in your pocket if you choose to use it. Of course, there is the requirements mapping matrices that Joy was showing you and that I showed you as well. I go back to one of those here. So those are both options for you to use as tools, but again, all of this supported in one consistent platform with version control, social discussions, and simulation, and so on. So at this point, we are about 10 minutes to the hour. What I'd like to do is flip over and maybe address some of the questions that you folks have been typing in. So now's a good time to type in any additional questions you may have. And bear with me a moment while I have a look at a couple and see. Okay, so here's one. So Joy, you're still unmuted and available?
I'm here.
There we go. Okay. All right, so here's one. It says, this one's for you. It says that you said that people versus system in the business process, that you like to separate those. Mm-hmm. They ask, but they are related, so how do we show that relation or association if they're separate.
Yep. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I get that
By the way,
often when I say that.
If you need the screen, just let me know and I'll hand it back to you to help explain if you
Okay,
need
yeah, I don't think, right now I'm good,
Okay.
I think, but I will. Yep. So I'm going to tell you, so first thing I'm going to say up front is this is a guideline, certainly not a hard and fast rule. There are cases where you actually really do need to put people in the swim lane and a system in another swim lane, okay? So this is simply a guideline. Now, what I will tell you is that the interaction between them is something that I would typically do more in something like a use case, and not dissimilar from what you guys were just seeing there on the screen, right, where I'm going to show that detailed level interaction of how an individual user interacts with an existing, with a system. And so when I want to show both of them together, that's the model that I would typically pick. Again, there is a time and a place, though, to put people and systems in the same flow. I'm totally okay with that. The other thing I'll say is that sometimes you can actually line up your process flows and your system flows, so you can kind of see here's what the people are doing and here's what the system is doing separately. So I'm not sure if that answered it. I will tell you, I guess the other thing I'll add to that is probably 80–90% of what we do is actually process flows. We do a lot less of the system flows. And we really focus on what are the tasks that people are trying to do. And occasionally you might even just have a box or two that's, something going on in the system just to simplify your diagram.
Okay. I have a real easy one for you. What does DAR stand for?
It's Display Action Response. And I will tell you the name. If you go back to the element table, if you were to look at that, you would see what we're capturing is the display requirements, and then the action and the response requirements, which are the behavior requirements.
Yeah, you should see that now, I think.
There you go. So display, action, and response are right in the middle of that table. That's where the name came from.
Okay, great. Okay, I got one here for me. They're saying, do you need web development skills to make that simulator work? And the answer is absolutely not. Blueprint, the target user for Blueprint is business analyst. So if there's anything in here that a business analyst cannot use, it's not in there. Yeah, so, these screens are all created drag and drop. We basically associate them with steps of the process. You hit the button, you're simulating. Any of these controls that I showed you in the utility to make the screen, like the drop downs, pull that on, and then you can basically go into preview mode, and this will drop down. Okay, and if you want to double-click, you can define what your elements are to be, like T-shirts, so on and so forth. So it really is that easy to make these simulations work. Next one for Joy. This is an interesting one. It says, is the approach that you've showed, is it appropriate for any type of project? For example, when we customize custom software applications, I assume they're referring to things like SAP or Salesforce.
Okay, yeah. Yep, great question. So I would say the approach is applicable to most types of projects. I'm going to answer that question, but I want to also make a reference in a few, and as we wrap up the call, you're going to see a screenshot of a book that came out last year. It's our visual models for software requirements, where we talk about all these models, actually all 22 models in more detail. And in it, in the appendix, there is a matrix that tells you, given the type of project that you're on, what models are you likely to need to use. So there actually is a nice quick reference in there for things like I'm doing what might be called a COTS project, or I've purchased some software, vendor implementation, call it whatever you want. Basically I would be able to look that up and see what are the models that I would likely need in that particular type of project. The reason that this is still useful for you, it's a little bit different how you would use it. The process flows, absolutely, because you're going to want to model the process for how your users do their job today, and how then you have to look at how do they use the new tool to do that, whatever that new software is that you're putting in place. The DAR model, you're not going to use it so much for designing a user interface, because you're going to have purchased one most likely. Maybe you're adding elements to it and you're doing some customization, and certainly that works just the same as though you were developing new software. But what's interesting is you can actually use that DAR model to capture your configuration requirements. So when you're doing where you've purchased software and you're doing an implementation of that software, It's that implementation software, you're spending so much more time on configuration than you are writing code, right? So it's a tool to help you do that, to think about the different elements in the existing application. So your screenshots could be right out of their actual software that you purchased. And you're still going to want to fill in those pieces of information to make sure that you understand how are the business rules getting implemented in this user interface.
Okay. Quick one for me. Somebody's asking, can Blueprint be used in an Agile approach as well? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you head to the website, under the Solutions tab, it'll talk all about how Blueprint is being applied to Agile and even Agile at scale, which is kind of a nastier issue, but many customers are using Blueprint to help facilitate their Agile at scale processes. Again, if you go to the website under Solutions tab, you'll see Blueprint for Enterprise Agile, which is in fact a package solution for that particular need. Okay, a specific question, Joy. They were asking, I believe it was in the element table, or it could have been one of the other ones. They were confused about your use of, it was for the filter, so the element table. They're asking about the difference or the usage of the or versus and.
Okay,
You
yeah.
had a discussion on that, and they were confused.
Okay, yeah, so what we're trying to show there, and it may be worth, Tony, can you just flip back to the slide where we show that filter?
Yeah.
It's the one that says Add to Cart DAR at the top of it.
Okay, bear with me while I go up.
Yeah. Yep.
This one?
My example, go up one more. That one. Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm talking about the next to last row in that table. So what that particular row is telling us is that if the user has picked criteria for more than one filter, then how should the product results show? And what we're saying is that we're saying that the requirement is that if there's filter 1 value and a filter 2 value, that I want to show products that have both filter 1 and filter 2 values as true, right, that match. Right, so if I picked that I want filter 1 to be red and I want filter 2 to be large for size, let's say, then I'm only going to show products where there are red and large available. So if a product's red but it only came in medium, then I wouldn't show it in my results. So that's what that row is telling me. Okay. As I was designing this, I could have gone the other direction and said when I pick red and I pick large, I want to show everything that's either red or large. So it's a very different meaning, and my example was to illustrate why you want to use this table, why you want to specify requirements at this level of detail. Because if you, particularly I've seen this when I have sent requirements to an offshore development team to be built, the assumptions that they make are very different than the assumptions that I make. And so I'd like to not make any assumptions. So the idea here is I would specify for them I want that to be an and, because I don't know that they would build it that way otherwise.
Okay, perfect. We are pretty much at the top of the hour. There's one last question I'll just take real fast, and they're asking about Blueprint integrating with TFS. So answer yes. Basically what Blueprint does is it, of course, develops and defines the requirements, and through review and approve, they're all validated, etc., through simulation. So it will take all that requirements information and push it over to Team Foundation server. Even the graphical information, even the comments, even all the traceability gets populated into TFS, and then it will generate the tests automatically as well from the requirements information. Push that over, and all the traceability to that as well. So that is what gets populated over to TFS from Blueprint, and that's the nature of the integration. As I mentioned right up near the beginning, in just a matter of a few weeks, Blueprint's going to be launching a new release that will have a long list of new integrations, and so there'll be another choice for integrating with TFS, which is bidirectional. So that's just a few weeks away. Okay, with that, I just want to be respectful of people's time. Thank you so much for spending the hour with us today. A couple last slides just to close it off, which in fact I probably should have done earlier. By the way, people have been asking about recordings and the slides themselves. Yes, these will be made available to you. We'll have a follow-up email to everybody who registered and attended, showing you how you can get access to the recording and access to the slides. So if you're not able to jot down these links here, don't worry too much about it. You'll get an email shortly. So both SEI level and Blueprint have books available via these links. Visual models for software requirements. So what Joy was going through today is just a tiny part of what's in her excellent book. Highly recommended. And Blueprint has requirements definition management for dummies available. We both have blogs. The links are there. clevel.com and blueprintsys.com/blog. Takeaway. From these links, you can, from C-Level, download the RML Quick Reference. And from Blueprint, if you happen to be in the market for a requirements solution, we have a request for proposal or RFP template listing out the criteria, the things you should be looking for and consider when shopping. Finally, both our companies have a presence at the upcoming BBC show, which is in Las Vegas. And this is really soon, next week, in fact. I think that's Tuesday, I believe, November 11th. So if you happen to be going to that show, please drop by. We'd love to meet you in person and have a chat, answer any other questions you may have. And with that, I just want to thank you. Any questions we didn't get to, and there are a lot, just send them off. If it's a C-Level question, info@clevel.com. Blueprint question, info@blueprintsys.com. And there is a Twitter hashtag as well. If you want to post questions through that, we will answer them as well. Okay, thank you all so much for spending the time with us today. Thank you, Joy. And
thank you, Tony.
You're welcome. With that, we'll be sending everybody an email, as I mentioned, with a link to the recording and the slides. All right, have a great day, everyone. Thank you for attending.